Whispers from the unknown. In the heart of a fog-laden town, there was a street no one spoke of except in whispers. Elm Street. Its cobblestones were uneven, worn by time and the weight of forgotten secrets. Nestled between two derelict buildings was a curious antique shop with a hand-carved sign that read curiosities and relics. The windows were dim and layered with grime, revealing only the faintest outline of countless relics inside. Clara Henderson tightened her scarf against the chill as she hesitated outside. She had stumbled upon the shop during a walk meant to clear her mind. A struggling journalist for a small online publication, Clara had been tasked with producing a compelling story, one that would ignite curiosity, clicks, and engagement. But inspiration had eluded her for weeks, and the pressure was beginning to weigh heavily. A bell chimed overhead as she stepped inside, breaking the oppressive silence. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood, mothballs, and something else she couldn't quite place, an earthy undertone, almost metallic. Shelves sagged under the weight of peculiar artifacts, tarnished mirrors, chipped porcelain dolls, and books with cracked leather spines. Looking for something specific, the voice startled Clara. She turned to find a hunched man behind the counter, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes, sharp and piercing, studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Just browsing," she said quickly, hoping to avoid any awkward conversation. The man chuckled dryly. "People don't stumble in here without a reason, miss. There's always something calling them." Clara offered a tight smile and moved deeper into the shop, pretending to ignore him. Her gaze flitted over the items, many of which were clearly more decorative than functional. She was about to leave when she spotted it. A small, intricately carved music box sitting atop a dusty table in the corner. Its craftsmanship was exquisite. Delicate floral patterns intertwined with strange symbols she didn't recognize. As if drawn by an invisible thread, she reached out and lifted the lid. A haunting melody filled the air, soft, almost mournful. It was beautiful, yet unsettling. Each note laced with an odd dissonance that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "That one," the shopkeeper said, his voice closer now, sending a jolt through her. "It's not for the faint of heart." Clara snapped the lid shut. "What do you mean?" The man leaned against the counter, his face finally catching the light. His features were sharp, almost skeletal, his expression unreadable. It belonged to someone who poured their soul into it. A pianist named Lucille Moreau. Tragic story, really. Some say her spirit never left it. I'd think twice before taking it home. Clara hesitated, her journalistic instincts warring with the unease prickling at the back of her neck. "Why sell it if it's cursed? Everything has its price," he replied cryptically, "but not everyone's willing to pay it." She should have left then. She should have walked out and never looked back. But the melody still echoed faintly in her mind, and her curiosity had already sunk its claws into her. Before she knew it, she was handing over a few crumpled bills, the shopkeeper's warning fading into the background. As Clara stepped outside with the music box tucked under her arm, the fog seemed denser, the world quieter. She shook off the sensation and started walking home. The first sign of unease came halfway there, the distinct feeling of being watched. She turned, but the street was empty, the dim glow of streetlights barely piercing the mist. Shrugging it off, she quickened her pace. The second sign came later that night. The music box sat on her desk, untouched since she'd arrived home. Yet as Clara drifted into a restless sleep, she heard the melody again. Faint at first, then louder, as though it was seeping through the walls. In her dream, she saw a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow. It stood motionless, its head tilted as if listening to the melody. Humming along, its face was obscured, but Clara could feel its malice, a cold, suffocating presence that pressed against her chest. When she woke, gasping for breath, her hands trembled. The music box was still closed, its lid as she'd left it, but the haunting melody echoed faintly in her ears. Chapter 1. The Allure of the Unknown. The air outside was damp with a lingering drizzle of late November. Clara Henderson pulled her coat tighter as she walked down Elm Street, her boots tapping against the cracked pavement. She was supposed to be home, working on a feature piece about the resurgence of urban legends in small towns. but her steps had unconsciously veered toward the antiquated shop she had passed by so many times. Its presence was magnetic yet off-putting. The sign above the door, "Curiosities and Keepsakes," dangled precariously, swaying with a creak that seemed louder than it should have been in the still air. The windows were clouded with dust, but faint shapes inside hinted at an eclectic collection of forgotten treasures. Clara hesitated on the threshold, debating whether she should turn back. But something whispered to her, not an audible voice, but a tug deep within her chest, urging her to cross the threshold. She opened the door, and a bell jingled above her, its chime unnaturally resonant, as if the sound stretched and folded into itself. Inside, the shop smelled of aged wood, mothballs, and something metallic, like blood. Shelves were crammed with oddities, rusted tools, cracked porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware, and books whose spines were so worn their titles were illegible. The lighting was dim, the kind of dimness that made shadows flicker in the corners of your vision. "Welcome," came a voice from behind the counter. Clara jumped slightly, her gaze snapping to the figure standing there. The shopkeeper was an old man with hair, so silvery it seemed almost translucent under the yellow light. His face was sharp, his cheekbones pronounced, and his pale eyes seemed to peer right through her. Just browsing," Clara managed, forcing a smile. "Of course you are," the man replied, his voice low and gravelly, like leaves scraping across pavement. "Everything here is looking for the right owner. Perhaps something will choose you." The way he said it sent a chill skittering down her spine. She turned away quickly, her eyes scanning the shelves, trying to distract herself from the uncomfortable feeling that the shopkeeper was watching her every move. And then she saw it. It sat on a low shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of dusty books. A small music box, its silver casing tarnished with age, engraved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift under the light. Clara knelt to get a closer look, drawn to it by an inexplicable fascination. When she reached out to touch it, the metal was cold against her fingertips, colder than it should have been. "That one," the shopkeeper said suddenly, his voice closer than she expected. She flinched and turned to see him standing just a few feet away, though she hadn't heard him move. "It's beautiful," Clara said, though the word felt strange on her tongue. There was something unsettling about the box, but she couldn't look away. "It has a story," the man said. "A tragic one." Clara raised an eyebrow. "What kind of story?" The corners of his mouth twitched upward in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If you're curious, take it. But be warned, it doesn't like to be ignored." The cryptic warning sent another shiver through her, but curiosity outweighed caution. She bought the music box, feeling a strange sense of relief as she left the shop, as if she had narrowly escaped something, though she couldn't say what. As she walked home, the street seemed quieter than usual, the shadows darker. The air pressed against her skin, heavy and suffocating. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, certain she heard footsteps behind her, but the street was empty. Then came the melody. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the city. But as she neared her apartment, it grew louder, a haunting, lilting tune that seemed to seep into her bones. She stopped in her tracks, searching for its source, but the street was silent. The box was tucked away in her bag, and she hadn't opened it. That night, as Clara lay in bed, the melody played again, not from the box, but somewhere deep in her mind. Her dreams were filled with shadows that twisted and writhed, and in the center of them stood a figure. Its outline was indistinct, as if veiled in smoke, but its presence was suffocating. It hummed the melody in a low, rasping voice that made her blood run cold. When she woke, her skin was damp with sweat, and the melody was still there, faint but persistent, echoing in the corners of her mind. She didn't notice the scratches on the inside of her bedroom window until the next morning, deep gouges etched into the glass, as though made by something clawing to get in. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Dark. The music box sat on Clara's coffee table, its tarnished silver surface catching the faint glow of her apartment's single lamp. She hadn't opened it since bringing it home, but the melody from her dreams lingered in her mind like a phantom. It was late, and the apartment was silent save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Unable to resist any longer, Clara reached out and lifted the lid of the music box. The melody began softly, a hauntingly beautiful tune that sent chills down her spine. Each note seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, weaving a soundscape that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. But as the song played on, Clara noticed something strange. Beneath the melody was a discordant undertone, faint but jarring, like the sound of nails scraping against metal. She snapped the lid shut, but the sensation of unease lingered, burrowing deep into her chest. The room felt colder, the shadows darker. Clara shook her head, laughing nervously at her own paranoia. It was just an old music box, she told herself. Yet the strangeness began almost immediately. Later that night, as Clara sat at her desk reviewing her research notes, she heard the faint strains of the melody again. She froze, her pen hovering over the page. Slowly, she turned to the music box on the table. The lid was closed, but the melody was unmistakable, as though the box were humming to itself. A sharp clatter from the kitchen made her jump. Clara rushed in to find a cup had fallen from the counter. It hadn't shattered, but it was lying far from where she had left it. The hairs on her arms stood on end as she picked it up, feeling the weight of a presence she couldn't see. The following days were worse. Clara began noticing small, inexplicable changes in her apartment. Picture frames were slightly askew, though she hadn't touched them. Books she had neatly stacked were found scattered on the floor. And the shadows, always the shadows, seemed to stretch and flicker in ways they shouldn't. Determined to understand the object that had invaded her life, Clara began researching the music box. She combed through online forums and antique catalogs, trying to trace its history. After hours of dead ends, she stumbled upon a faded photograph of the box in an article about a 19th century pianist, Lucille Moreau. Lucille had been a prodigy, celebrated for her compositions that were said to evoke otherworldly beauty. But her fame was short-lived. She disappeared without a trace during the winter of 1876, leaving behind only fragmented notes of an unfinished requiem. Rumors swirled around her death. Some said she was murdered by a jealous rival. Others claimed she had delved into the occult, her soul consumed by her own music. Clara dug deeper and uncovered an unsettling pattern. Over the decades, the music box had surfaced in various estates and auctions. Each time, its owners met tragic ends: suicides, violent accidents, mysterious disappearances. It was as if the box carried a curse, its melody an omen of doom. Then came the messages. Clara woke one morning to find her notebook open on the kitchen table, though she hadn't remembered leaving it there. Scribbled across the page in her own handwriting were 3 words: heed the melody. Her breath hitched as she stared at the jagged letters, her hand trembling. She hadn't written them, she was certain of it. Yet the ink was fresh, and the handwriting was undeniably hers. That night, the dreams returned. The shadowy figure stood closer now, its form still indistinct, but its presence suffocating. The melody played louder, reverberating in her skull. The figure whispered words she couldn't understand, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. When Clara awoke, she found more messages scrawled around her apartment, in the margins of her notes, on scraps of paper, even on her bathroom mirror. All bore the same cryptic warning: heed the melody. Her heart pounded as she stared at the words. Whatever this box was, it wasn't just an antique. It was something far darker, far more dangerous, and it wasn't going to let her go. Chapter 3. The Curse Unveiled. Clara sat hunched over her desk, the dim light from her desk lamp casting sharp shadows across the room. In front of her lay the music box, its lid open, the haunting melody spilling into the silence. Next to it, she had scrawled frantic notes on scraps of paper, her handwriting jagged and hurried. Through countless hours of research, she had uncovered the truth about the music box. The melody was not merely a song. It was a fragment of a requiem composed by Lucille Moreau, the pianist whose tragic disappearance had become the stuff of legend. The fragment was said to summon the wounded whisper, a malevolent spirit born of Lucille's anguish. It was tied to betrayal, heartbreak, and rage, a cursed echo of the life Lucille had lost. Clara's obsession deepened. Despite the warnings etched in her own handwriting and the creeping dread that clawed at her sanity, she became fixated on completing the requiem. She convinced herself that doing so would lift the curse, that it would grant her freedom from the oppressive melody that now played constantly in her mind. At first, the act of composing was almost cathartic. The melody unfurled in her head, fragments of new notes weaving their way into her consciousness as though whispered directly by unseen forces. But as the days passed, Clara began to lose herself. Hours slipped through her fingers, entire evenings disappearing into a blur of ink-stained pages and the incessant sound of the music box. Her apartment grew colder, the walls seeming to close in as shadows writhed in the corners of her vision. And then Lucille came. It started with faint glimpses, a silhouette lingering at the edge of Clara's periphery, a fleeting reflection in the window that wasn't her own. But soon, the spirit's presence grew undeniable. Late one night, as Clara scribbled furiously in her notebook, the air around her grew heavy. She turned, her breath hitching as she saw Lucille standing in the doorway. The spirit was shrouded in darkness, her features obscured as though blurred by smoke. But her eyes, wide, hollow, and brimming with unspoken fury, were impossible to ignore. Lucille's form flickered as though caught between worlds, her figure stretching unnaturally as she stepped closer. "Finish it," the spirit rasped, her voice fractured, like glass shattering in slow motion. Clara screamed and stumbled backward, knocking the music box to the floor. The melody stopped abruptly, but the silence that followed was worse. When Clara glanced at her reflection in the window, she froze. Long, jagged cuts crisscrossed her skin, though she felt no pain. The next morning, desperate and terrified, Clara reached out to Elijah Cruz, a paranormal investigator she had once interviewed for a story. At first, Elijah was skeptical, chalking her story up to exhaustion and stress. But when the music box played on its own and the room filled with a suffocating chill, his disbelief melted into reluctant acceptance. Elijah began his own investigation, combing through occult texts and records of Lucille's life. Together, he and Clara pieced together the tragic tale of the pianist. Betrayed by her lover and driven mad by heartbreak, Lucille had poured her anguish into her final composition, a requiem meant to bind her tormentor to her forever. But the ritual had backfired, tethering Lucille's vengeful spirit to the music itself. The only way to sever the connection, Elijah explained, was through an ancient ritual that required a personal sacrifice from the cursed. Clara's blood ran cold as she read the details. The ritual demanded the destruction of what tethered the cursed to the living world, the music box itself. But the act required the life force of the one bound by the curse. Clara's hands shook as she looked at Elijah. "There has to be another way." Elijah's expression was grim. "There isn't. You either end this, or it ends you." Clara glanced at the music box, its tarnished surface glinting faintly in the dim light. She could almost hear the whispers urging her forward, their voices a mix of pleading and command. "Then we do the ritual," she said, her voice steady despite the terror curling in her chest. But deep down, she wondered if Lucille had already won. Chapter 4. The Ritual and the Betrayal. Clara's apartment was a war zone of overturned furniture and shattered glass by the time the night of the ritual arrived. The spirit's attacks had grown relentless, leaving her body bruised and her nerves frayed. Elijah had done his best to stabilize her, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos surrounding them. Together, they had gathered the required components for the ritual: candles infused with salt, a mirror rimmed in iron, and a black silk cloth meant to trap the spirit's essence. The instructions were painstakingly clear, yet impossibly ominous. Elijah laid them out on the floor, his voice steady as he recited the incantation they would need. But even as Clara nodded along, an unease crept into her thoughts. The atmosphere was thick with tension, not just from the spirit's presence, but from something unspoken in Elijah's tone. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Positive," Elijah said, not meeting her eyes. They worked quickly, arranging the components into a precise formation. Clara lit the candles, their flames flickering in the cold, unnatural drafts that seemed to seep through the walls. The mirror was placed upright at the center, reflecting the room in fractured shadows. As Clara opened the music box and the haunting melody began to play, the room seemed to shudder. The air grew heavier, and a low, guttural moan reverberated through the space. The spirit of Lucille emerged, her form more solid than ever before. Her face was still obscured by shadow, but her eyes burned with rage and sorrow. "End it," Lucille hissed, her voice layered with anguish and fury. Clara began the incantation, her voice shaky but determined. Each word felt like a carried weight, pulling the spirit closer to the mirror. Lucille's figure twisted and writhed, her movements jerky and inhuman as she resisted. But then, midway through the ritual, Elijah's hand closed around Clara's wrist, yanking her away from the circle. "What are you doing?" she screamed, struggling against his grip. Elijah's face was a mask of cold calculation. "You don't understand what you've brought me, Clara. This isn't just a cursed object, it's a conduit. With it, I can harness Lucille's power." Clara's stomach dropped. "You lied to me," she whispered, horrified. "I didn't lie," Elijah said, his tone almost apologetic. "I just didn't tell you everything. You think you're the first person to stumble into this curse? Lucille's music is more than a requiem. It's a key to something far greater. And if you just let me finish," Clara shouted, shoving him away. Lucille's spirit screamed, her rage palpable as the melody from the box grew deafening. Shadows coiled around the room, pulsating with malevolence. The music box, still playing, seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, its sound sharper, more piercing. In the chaos, Clara lunged for the box, her fingers brushing its icy surface. Elijah tackled her, slamming her to the floor. "You don't know what you're doing," he bellowed. "Neither do you," Clara snapped, kicking him off. She scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she reached for the box again. This time, she didn't hesitate. As her fingers closed around it, a surge of cold shot through her arm, freezing her to the core. The melody shifted, growing frantic, desperate. Lucille's spirit lunged at her, her form dissolving into a storm of darkness that swirled around Clara like a vortex. But Clara didn't stop. She raised the box high above her head and smashed it against the ground with all her strength. The sound that followed was indescribable, a mix of shattering glass, tortured screams, and a crescendo of notes that seemed to tear through reality itself. The room exploded with light and shadow, the force knocking both Clara and Elijah to the floor. When the chaos subsided, Clara opened her eyes to find the music box reduced to shards, its melody silenced at last. Lucille's spirit was gone, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Elijah lay motionless nearby, his face pale and expressionless. Clara didn't know if he was unconscious or worse, but she didn't care. The curse was broken, or so she thought. The faint echo of the melody lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that some things are never truly destroyed. Chapter 5, The Cycle Reborn. The fire consumed everything. The music box splintered under Clara's final act of defiance, its haunting melody distorting into a cacophony of broken notes before silencing entirely. For a moment, the room was still, save for the acrid scent of smoke and the sound of Clara's labored breathing. Lucille's spirit had screamed, a sound that would haunt Clara's mind for as long as she lived. But now, the oppressive chill was gone. The shadows that had once writhed in every corner of her apartment reduced to nothing. Elijah lay unconscious nearby, his face pale, but his chest rising and falling steadily. Clara's own strength was fading fast, her blood pooling beneath her where she knelt. She had known the ritual would require a sacrifice, but she hadn't anticipated how much it would take. The edges of her vision blurred as exhaustion overtook her. She collapsed onto the floor, her fingers brushing against the box's shattered remains. Her last thought, before darkness claimed her, was one of relief. It was over, or so she thought. Days later, the police entered Clara's apartment following a report from concerned neighbors. They found no trace of her, only the faint scent of smoke and an unsettling stillness. The room was untouched, save for a single shard of the music box sitting atop her desk. Months passed. The shard found its way into a pawn shop across town, its faint hum catching the attention of passersby. It wasn't long before someone else, young, curious, and seeking something extraordinary, picked it up. As they walked out of the shop, clutching the shard in their hand, a haunting melody began to play faintly in the distance, and the cycle began anew. If you enjoyed tonight's spine-chilling stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next tale. Remember, when darkness falls, nothing is ever truly safe. Until we meet again, keep your lights dim, lock your doors tight, and never take your eyes off the shadows. You never know what's lurking out there, waiting for you.